All right, today we are going to be talking about the extensions and modifications of basic principles. Firstly, we're going to start off talking about the classic paper, which was the genetic basis of Haldane's rule. And to talk about this paper, we first have to know what Haldane's rule stated. So this rule stated when in the F1 offspring of two different animal races, one of the sexes is absent, race, or sterile, that sex is the heterozygous sex. Haldane's rule had three explanations listed in the paper. One was that males are innately more sensitive than females to the effects of hybridization. However, Haldane immediately rejected this explanation due to the fact that there are groups of animals, such as birds and butterflies, that have heterogamic females that also show female sterility. So it's not just in males that this occurs in. The second explanation was the one that Haldane himself and many others supported originally, and it was the thought that heterogamic infertility in hybrids arise from a genetic imbalance between the X chromosomes and the autosomes. And the third explanation was the syndrome is caused by the mismatching of an X and Y chromosome. So the author of this paper, Coyne, he is going to investigate both those bottom two explanations a little bit more. Coyne set up two different studies using fruit flies, and the first one was to test the X autosomal imbalance theory. He tested this by producing interspecific hybrid females that would receive both X chromosomes from a single parent species, and they basically had a mass mating event to see how much of them were fertile. The females would have the same amount of X autosomes mismatched as the sterile males, therefore would be expected to be sterile. However, you can see from this bottom table that was not the case. The results showed no decrease in fertility, which kind of indicates that this theory cannot be the explanation for Haldane's rule. The second experiment Coyne set up had two different crosses. Cross A had completely discordant X and Y chromosomes, and this cross showed to have 5 out of the 615 individuals had motile sperm. And then there was cross B that had a mixture of the X chromosomal matter of two different species of fruit fly and a Y chromosome from only one of the species. And this showed 65 of 682 individuals had motile sperm. So these results were shown to be significant, and the infertility in the fruit flies seemed to arise from the genetic interaction between the X and Y chromosomes rather than the imbalance between the X chromosomes and autosomes.
So I am going to be talking about our found paper, which was titled Haldane's Rule in the 21st Century. This paper is more of a summary paper, and basically what it did was that it compiled a bunch of different studies that have been conducted over the past 15 years, and they briefly explained them. So Haldane's Rule, or HR as they called it in the paper, has been confirmed in groups such as Diptera, Mammalia, Orthoptera, Talisci, Amphibia, Aves, Leptodera, and Reptilia. The two main theories of HR are the dominance theory and the faster male theory, which I will talk about a little more on the next slide. Throughout the past 15 years since this paper has been published, researchers have shifted their focus to the lesser known groups of Haldane's rule, which are Amphibia, Reptilia, and Teleosti. By studying these lesser known groups, researchers have discovered new insights for testing HR. Of the 85 studies that were conducted, around 20% had patterns that were not predicted by Haldane's rule. These can be explained by postulating cytonuclear incompatibilities. The table to the right depicts a summary of all of the studies done since 1996 of Haldane's rule, and it talks about the different taxons that were studied, along with which gender had more sterility genes. The first theory that I'm going to be talking about is the dominance theory. This theory states that if there are BDM incompatibilities between the genes, the autosomes, and the sex chromosomes, then the F1 homogametic generation will be heterozygous for all of the genes. They will also go through a fitness loss, but only for the X-linked genes that are dominant. In 1997, Torelli and Begun completed a study that confirmed the role for dominance. In their study, they found that pairs of Drosselia with large X chromosomes were able to develop HR faster than normal. The faster male evolution theory explains that male genes are exposed to two different types of sexual selection, male-male competition and female choice, while female genes are only exposed to female choice. Because of the pressure placed on male genes results in a quicker evolution. Genetic studies has also revealed that in species, there are more often male sterility genes than female sterility genes. Aves and Leptodera, however, are the exception. These groups often suffer from female sterility more than male sterility. Therefore, they do not support the faster male theory. Another promising approach could be to look for HR that can be artificially induced into changing their sex, such as certain amphibia or species that regularly undergo sex changes, such as Teleoste. Perrin in 2009 discovered that when an organism undergoes a sex change, that could stop the differentiation of sex chromosomes in the heterogametic sex. In these certain cases, it could possibly allow for the study to determine the primary causes of Haldane's rule. With the mapping of evolution of sterility in males and females using phylogenetic trees, it may be possible to determine a detailed dissection of Haldane's rule.
So looking at chapter 5, one of the main points that we talked about was dominance. So dominance doesn't alter the way genes are inherited and is a result of interactions between genes of the same locus, or the allelic genes. So we have 3 different kinds of dominance. So the first one that can be used is complete dominance. So this is when the heterozygote has the same phenotype as one homozygote. The second kind is codominance, which is when the heterozygote exhibits traits from both of the parental homozygotes. And lastly, there is incomplete dominance, which means that the heterozygote has a phenotype which is intermediate between both of the 2 parental homozygotes. So some examples of these are listed here. So first of all, we have brown eye color in humans. So this is an example of complete dominance, because it only takes one brown allele to have brown eyes. So for example, the blue eye color is recessive, but if you have a heterozygote with one brown and one blue allele, it's always going to be brown because brown is always dominant in the eye colors. Then we have an example of codominance is the blood type MN. So within this, there's 2 different alleles, one that codes for the M antigen and another code for the N antigen. So homozygotes with both M antigens have the M blood type, whereas the homozygotes with the N antigen have the N blood type. However, if you're a heterozygote and have both an M and an N antigen, you'll produce the MN blood type and exhibit both. So this then is the example of the codominance. And then lastly, looking at the incomplete dominance, we can look at flowers. So if we see that we have a white flower and a red flower crossed, their offspring is going to be pink flowers. So this is showing that there's an intermediate between the 2. So instead of having white or red being dominant, you get kind of a mix of both and end up with pink flowers. So the next big point and takeaway from chapter 5 were sex-linked characteristics. So a sex-linked characteristic is the phenotype is determined by genes located on the sex chromosomes. Then we also have sex-influenced characteristics, which is when the phenotype is determined by the autosomal genes that are more readily expressed in one sex. And then lastly, we have the sex-limited characteristics, and this is when the phenotype is determined by the autosomal gene whose expression is limited to only one sex. So looking at examples, first we can look at color blindness in humans, which we've discussed before, which is an example of a sex-linked trait. Then if we look at an example of a sex-influenced trait, we can look at the image over to the right from our book, looking at beards in goats. So the presence of a beard is dominant in males, however, it's a recessive trait in females. So this means that males only need one allele coding for a beard, whereas the females would need 2. So it's much more prevalent in the male goats as compared to the females. And then if we look at a sex-limited characteristic, we can look at domestic chickens. So in this picture below, we see that A depicts the cock feathering. So cock feathering is an autosomal recessive trait. So this means that it's limited to only males. So all female chickens and some males will have the hen feathering, which is shown in B and C. However, the genotype for the males and females with the recessive for the cock feathering is the same. However, the phenotype is different. So even though they both have a lowercase h, the males will have the cock feathering and the females will exhibit the hen feathering. So that means that it's a sex-limited characteristic. So looking at the relationship to Chapter 5 to Haldane's rule, we discussed a lot about dominance. So dominance was the most important underlying component of Haldane's rule. The rule also stated that the infertility of hybrids is more likely to affect the heterogametic gender. So this relates to our sex-linked characteristics that we discussed. So this basically says that one sex is more affected. So however, this sex that is affected can vary across species. So we know that in humans and, for example, flies, the males possess the XY. So they're their heterogametic species, which means that the males are going to be more affected. However, if we look at ducks, as well as other kinds of birds and fishes, many of them exhibit the ZY, and it's actually the females that are the heterogametic gender. So the females are going to be more effective. So overall, understanding dominance and the sex-linked characteristics set the groundwork for the development and understanding of Haldane's rule. So without the previous understanding of the sex-linked characteristics and dominance, Haldane's rule would not exist.